Leah had always known the land would shape her fate, but nothing in her past could have prepared her for the day the Arizona sun sought to claim her as its own. The heat was not merely an element, it was a living entity, a predator that pressed down from a sky the color of bleached bone, sucking the moisture from the air, from the brittle grass, and from the very marrow of her bones. For 2 days, she had walked since the last of her water had run out, her world shrinking to the cracked, red earth beneath her worn-out boots and the relentless shimmer of heat that danced on the horizon, promising a salvation that was never there. The memory of the men who had robbed her husband's wagon, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back, had faded, overshadowed by the more immediate tyranny of thirst. Her hand, raw and trembling, rested protectively over her stomach. It was a constant, unconscious gesture, a silent promise to the child who knew nothing of this scorched earth. Every rasping breath was for this child. Every agonizing step was for this child. But the land was unyielding. Her vision began to fray at the edges, the distant mesas blurring into a watercolor wash of purple and orange. The silence was absolute, broken only by the dry hiss of the wind and the frantic, desperate pounding of her own heart. She stumbled, her ankle twisting on a loose rock, and this time she did not have the strength to catch herself. The world tilted, the brutal sun spinning into a black void. And as she fell, a single silent prayer formed on her cracked lips. Live. He found her by the northern fence line, a place where the shadow of the black ridge offered a sliver of respite from the afternoon blaze. Caleb Thorne moved with the land, his steps measured and silent, a habit born from years of solitude. His eyes, the color of weathered slate, were trained to notice things that didn't belong: a broken strand of barbed wire, the track of a coyote, or a crumpled heap of faded calico that was certainly not a rock. He reined in his horse, a sturdy buckskin that snorted at the scent of something unfamiliar. For a long moment, Caleb did not move, his face a mask of hardened indifference carved by sun and silence. He had learned long ago that the desert offered up two kinds of surprises: trouble and death. This looked like a combination of both. As he dismounted, the ghost of a memory surfaced, cold and sharp as a winter wind. It was the memory of another person helpless under an uncaring sky, of a promise he had failed to keep, a familiar. Cold dread settled in his gut, the dread of being too late. He had sworn to himself he would never feel it again, an oath that had led him to this isolated ranch, to this life walled off by silence. He approached with caution. The woman was lying face down, her dark hair matted with red dust. He knelt, his movements economical, and gently turned her over. She was young, her face gaunt with exhaustion, but it was the pronounced swell of her belly that made his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't just a drifter, it was a woman carrying a child. The old wound in his memory twisted. He should have ridden on. He should have gone back to the simple, predictable rhythm of his life. Taking her in was a complication he could not afford. Redstone Gulch, the nearest town, was a lifetime away for someone in her state. A pit of gossip and suspicion run by men like Corbin Vance who fed on weakness. And yet, he could not leave her. The ghost of his past would not allow it. With a low curse that was lost to the wind, Caleb gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his own body. He carried her to his horse, laid her as gently as he could across the saddle, and began the slow, grim journey back home. Leah awoke to stillness. The oppressive weight of the sun was gone, replaced by a cool, dim twilight that smelled of pine wood, curing leather, and something else she couldn't quite name: the scent of profound, settled loneliness. She was lying on a simple cot, a coarse wool blanket pulled up to her chin. Her eyes fluttered open, slowly adjusting to the shadows of the one-room cabin. The walls were made of rough-hewn logs, the floor of packed earth. It was a place built for function, not comfort, a fortress against the outside world. Then she saw him. He was sitting at the table, his back to her, meticulously cleaning a rifle. The lamplight cast a warm glow on his broad shoulders. He moved with a quiet, focused intensity, each motion precise and deliberate. She shifted slightly, and the small groan that escaped her lips was a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. He stopped his work instantly. When he finally turned, his face was cast in shadow. He rose, his height seeming to fill the small cabin, and brought her a tin cup of water without a word. His hand was large and calloused, yet it was steady as he held it to her lips. She drank, the lukewarm water a balm to her parched throat. He watched her, his slate-gray eyes revealing nothing, no pity, no curiosity, no welcome. "You were lucky," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "The coyotes would have found you before nightfall." He offered no name and asked for none. He left her a plate with a piece of hardtack and some dried meat before returning to his work. The silence descending once more, heavier than before. The next few days passed in this strange, silent rhythm. Caleb Thorne. She had learned his name from a faded brand on a saddle blanket would rise before the sun. He would leave food and water for her before disappearing into the vastness of his ranch. He worked from dawn until dusk, a tireless machine of routine. Leah felt like a ghost in his home, a temporary guest in a life that had no room for another soul. But as her physical strength returned, the fierce, stubborn resilience of a mother began to stir within her. She would not be a burden. On the fourth day, she saw the latch on the chicken coop was broken. While he was out, she found a small hand axe and some old nails. Her body ached with the effort, but she worked methodically, setting the latch straight. It was a small repair, but it was a declaration. When Caleb returned, his eyes lingered on the newly repaired latch. He said nothing, but that night, the piece of meat on her plate was slightly larger. The true turning point came 2 days later. His buckskin horse, the one that had carried her, was suffering from a raging fever, its legs swollen from a festering cut. She watched Caleb's frustration, the quiet fear in his eyes. In this world, a good horse was life. That afternoon, she walked into the scrubland behind the barn. Her husband, a geologist with a passion for botany, had taught her much about the hidden properties of plants. She returned with her apron full of bitterroot and desert sage, crushing them into a thick, fragrant poultice. She approached the horse, speaking to it in a low, soothing voice. Caleb watched from the barn door, his face a mask of suspicion, but he did not stop her. She gently applied the poultice to the infected wound to draw out the heat and coax the animal to drink a tea brewed from the remaining leaves to soothe the fever. The next morning, the horse's fever had broken. It was standing, drinking deeply from the water trough for the first time in 2 days. Caleb stood by the fence, his silhouette stark against the rising sun. He turned his gaze to Leah, who was standing on the cabin porch. Their eyes met across the dusty yard. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't thanks, it was an acknowledgement. The silence between them remained, but its texture had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people who had found a new, unspoken language, the language of work, of resilience, of survival. In that silent nod, a pact was forged. She had earned her place. She would stay. The unspoken pact forged in the light of a new dawn did not bring words, but it reshaped the silence that flowed between them. It was no longer a void, an absence of connection, but a shared space, a territory they navigated with a quiet understanding. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Caleb remained a creature of habit, his life a testament to the discipline required to wrestle a living from the unforgiving earth. Yet, a subtle shift had occurred. He would leave a bucket of fresh well water on the porch in the early morning, knowing her back ached from the effort of drawing it herself, and say nothing. She, in turn, would ensure a pot of hot. Bitter coffee was waiting on the stove when he returned from the range, a silent offering of warmth against the chill of the high desert evenings. Leah knew that to truly have a place here, she needed to create something of her own, a patch of life that would be hers to nurture. Behind the cabin, near the well, was a small, sun-drenched patch of earth that the wind had blessed with a slightly richer soil. It was there she decided to make her stand. The work was brutal. The ground, baked hard by a decade of sun, resisted the rusty spade she found in the shed. Every shovelful was a battle, sending jarring shocks up her arms and putting a strain on her lower back. but with each clod of earth she overturned, she felt a piece of her own despair being turned with it. This small plot of land became her sanctuary, a place where she could pour her anxieties, her hopes, and the fierce, protective love for her unborn child into the soil. Caleb watched her from a distance, his expression unreadable. He never offered to help, never spoke a word of encouragement or doubt. But one morning, the rusty spade was gone, and in its place leaned a newer one, its wooden handle smooth and its steel edge sharp. A few days later, a burlap sack filled with rich, dark compost from the stables appeared beside her plot. These were his contributions, his silent acknowledgments. They were more meaningful than any words he could have offered. Slowly, painstakingly, she transformed the barren patch into a garden. She planted seeds saved from the wagon, carefully wrapped in a piece of oilcloth beans, squash, and hardy herbs. Tending to it became her daily ritual, a quiet conversation with the earth. As the first tender green shoots pushed their way through the red dirt, she felt a sense of hope so potent it almost brought her to tears. It was a mirror of the life growing inside her, a fragile, stubborn testament to survival in a place that offered none. The shared work and the growing garden began to slowly erode the walls of their solitude. The first crack in Caleb's armor came one evening as they sat on the porch. The sky a canvas of deep indigo and fading embers. He was sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound. Leah was looking towards the well, its dark silhouette a constant presence in their lives. "It's a deep well," she commented softly, more to herself than to him. "It must never run dry." The scraping stopped. Caleb's hands went still, his knuckles white around the handle of the knife. A shadow passed over his face, one that had nothing to do with the fading light. "It never has," he said, his voice flat and hard. "It's the only sure thing in this whole valley. It's why my brother is dead." The words fell into the quiet evening like stones, heavy and final. Leah didn't pry, sensing the immense weight behind them. She simply waited. After a long silence, he continued, his gaze fixed on the distant, dark ridge. "His name was Samuel, younger than me. He believed in the good of things, in the fairness of a man's word. He spoke of a survey line, of a dispute over the water rights with a man who wanted it all, a man who saw the well not as a source of life, but as a source of power. Corbin Vance sent his men. They said Samuel drew on them first. They lied. They shot him right where that fence post stands, all for a line on a map that Vance drew himself. The story was told without embellishment, a stark and brutal account of loss that explained the profound loneliness of the man beside her. It explained the gun he always wore, the watchfulness in his eyes, the high walls he had built around himself. The ranch was not just his home, it was a memorial, a legacy he was defending with his very soul. A few nights later, as Leah sat by the lamp mending one of his work shirts, her own story surfaced. Her fingers traced the worn fabric, a testament to a life of hard labor. Her husband, Arthur, had been a different kind of man. He was not a fighter, but a reader of rocks, of maps, of the earth's hidden stories. He was a geologist, she said softly, the words feeling strange on her tongue after so much silence. He believed this entire region was misunderstood. Others saw a wasteland. He saw a place filled with secrets. She spoke of his excitement, his conviction that there was a vast aquifer beneath the valley, a discovery that could bring life and prosperity to the area. His work had led him to Redstone Gulch, to a job surveying for the Ophir Mining Company, the largest operation in the territory. It was owned by Corbin Vance. "They said it was an accident," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. "A support beam collapsed in a new tunnel. He was the only one inside." A cold knot of suspicion, one she had tried to suppress for months, tightened in her gut. She didn't have proof. Only the chilling coincidence that Arthur had died just days after telling her he had found something significant. Something that would change everything. Caleb stopped his work. His head bowed. He didn't offer empty comforts or false assurances. He simply sat with her in the shared weight of their grief. Two people bound by a common, unseen enemy. The sanctuary they had built was more fragile than they knew, and the quiet rhythm of their lives was about to be broken. The intrusion came on a blistering hot afternoon. The air was still. The only movement the lazy circling of a hawk high above. Then, a low rumble. The sound of multiple horses approaching at a steady, arrogant pace. Caleb was instantly alert, his body going rigid. He moved to the door, his hand resting on the frame. His eyes narrowed on the plume of dust rising from the trail. 3 riders emerged from the heat shimmer. The man in the lead was Corbin Vance. He was dressed in a fine black coat, an absurd choice for the weather, a stark contrast to the dust and grit of the land he sought to conquer. His face was clean-shaven, his smile thin and predatory. The 2 men who flanked him were rougher, their hands never straying far from the pistols at their hips. They reined in before the cabin, their horses stomping impatiently. "Thorn," Vance called out, his voice smooth and condescending. "Still trying to make a go of it out here. I admire your persistence, though not your business sense." Caleb didn't move. "State your business, Vance, and then get off my land." Vance chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Always so direct. I'm simply here as a neighbor. I know things must be difficult. I'm prepared to make you another offer for this place. A generous one. It would save you a great deal of future hardship." He gestured vaguely at the ranch, his eyes dismissing it as worthless, all the while knowing the true value lay deep beneath the ground. It was then that Leah, drawn by the voices, appeared in the doorway behind Caleb, her hand resting on her swollen belly. Vance's eyes slid past Caleb and fixed on her. His thin smile widened, and his gaze moved over her with a slow, appraising insolence that made her skin crawl. He saw her not as a person, but as a complication, a weakness to be exploited. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice dripping with insinuation. "I see you've taken in a stray. Thorn, you always did have a soft spot for lost causes. I trust she's earning her keep." The insult hung in the hot, still air before Leah could even flinch. Something shifted in Caleb. The stoic, silent man she knew vanished, replaced by something older, more dangerous. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw his gun. He simply took one deliberate step to his left, his body squarely blocking Vance's view of her. It was a simple movement, but it was a declaration. He was a wall, he was a shield. His hand drifted down, his thumb hooking over his gun belt. His voice, when he spoke, was unnervingly calm, a low, lethal whisper that cut through the heat. "Vance, you have 10 seconds to turn your horses around before I forget what the law is." There was no bluff in his tone, only the cold promise of violence. Vance stared at him, his smile faltering for the first time, seeing not a stubborn rancher, but a man with nothing left to lose. He held Caleb's gaze for a moment longer, then gave a curt nod to his men. Without another word, they turned their horses and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and a silence thick with unspoken threats. The fragile peace of the ranch had been shattered, but as Leah looked at Caleb's unyielding back, she understood that something new had just been forged in its place. They were no longer just 2 strangers surviving side by side. They were a fortress, and the siege had just begun. The dust from Corbin Vance's departure settled, but the peace of the ranch did not return. A new tension had taken its place, a sharp, metallic taste of anticipation in the air. The silence between Caleb and Leah was no longer a space of healing, but the watchful quiet of a garrison on the eve of a siege. They moved through their daily chores with a grim purpose, their solitude for 2 now a fortress of 2. Caleb's eyes, once merely observant of the land, were now constantly scanning the horizon, searching for the first sign of the inevitable retaliation. The memory of his brother, Samuel, was no longer a dull ache of the past but a raw, immediate warning. He had lost his family once by underestimating Vance's ruthlessness. He would not make that mistake again. His evenings were now spent not just in weary silence, but in careful preparation. He would break down his rifle, cleaning and oiling each component with a methodical focus that bordered on ritual. He checked his supply of ammunition, his jaw set in a hard line. Each cartridge he inspected was a silent question. Would it be enough? Leah watched him, a knot of gratitude and guilt tightening inside her. She was the reason the storm had gathered over his home. His quiet, ordered world had been upended by her arrival. And now his very life was on the line because he had chosen to stand between her and the ambitions of a venomous man. This knowledge fueled her own quiet defiance. She worked tirelessly in her garden, harvesting and preserving every possible vegetable, her hands moving with a frantic energy, as if by storing up enough food for the winter, she could somehow repay the immense debt she owed him. The first volley in Vance's war was not fired with guns, but with whispers. A week after the confrontation, Caleb rode into Redstone Gulch for supplies. The town had always been wary of him, a place of cautious nods and transactional conversations. But this time was different. As he rode down the main street, conversations on porches halted in mid-sentence. Faces turned away, curtains and windows were drawn back and then quickly dropped. The air, usually thick with dust and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, was now thick with a hostile silence that followed him like his own shadow. The poison had been spread, and it had worked its way deep into the town's heart. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside. The store owner, a man named Henderson with whom Caleb had traded for years, froze behind the counter, his eyes darting away. "Henderson," Caleb said, his voice even. "I need flour, salt, and cartridges." Henderson wrung his hands on his apron, refusing to meet Caleb's gaze. I'm afraid I'm running low." "Caleb," he mumbled, his voice thin. "Big shipment for the Ophir mine came through. Cleaned me out of most things." It was a clumsy, transparent lie. Sacks of flour were clearly visible stacked against the far wall. Caleb's eyes swept over the fully stocked shelves, then returned to the store owner's nervous face. He understood. This wasn't about supplies, it was about allegiance. Vance owned the mine, and in a town like Redstone Gulch, that meant he owned the men. Caleb placed a few coins on the counter for a small bag of coffee beans, the only thing Henderson seemed willing to sell him, and turned to leave. He did not argue or protest. His anger was a cold, hard thing, too deep for a public display. As he stepped back out into the oppressive sunlight, he knew the truth. They were cut off. Vance had turned the entire town into a weapon, isolating them on their small patch of land, hoping to starve them out or break their will. He rode out of Redstone Gulch without a backwards glance, the silent judgment of the townspeople following him until he was just a speck on the horizon. The ranch was no longer a refuge, it was an island, and the sea of hostility was rising around them. He did not need to speak when he returned. Leah saw the truth in his rigid posture and the stark emptiness of his saddlebags. She met him on the porch, her face pale but her eyes resolute. "He's turned them against us," she said. Not a question, but a statement. Caleb gave a single, curt nod, dismounting and beginning to unsaddle his horse with stiff, angry movements. The unspoken had finally been brought into the light. Their quiet partnership of survival had now become an open alliance against a common enemy. The days that followed were filled with a new, focused intensity. They took stock of their resources, a grim accounting of their chances. The vegetables from Leah's garden, the smoked meat from the fall hunt, the grain in the silo. Caleb's remaining ammunition, these were the tools of their rebellion. Leah's knowledge of the land became more valuable than ever. She showed him which wild roots along the creek bed were edible, how to make a nourishing broth from bone and hardy herbs. Her contributions were no longer just about comfort, but about a stark calculation of survival. In this shared struggle, a profound change occurred. Caleb, who had lived his life in a self-imposed exile of grief, found a new purpose rising from the ashes of his old anger. His fight was no longer just about defending a memory, it was about protecting a future. A fragile, nascent thing embodied by the woman who worked silently beside him and the unborn child she carried. He began to see the ranch not as a tomb for his past, but as a cradle for something new. The final escalation came on a cool morning a week later. A lone rider was approaching, the sun glinting off the star on his chest. It was Sheriff Miller. Caleb saw him from the barn, his heart hardening into a cold knot. This was it. Vance was now using the law as his cudgel. Leah had come to the cabin door, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. Caleb met her eyes for a brief moment, an unspoken promise passing between them. Before he picked up the rifle leaning against the wall, he did not wait for the sheriff to reach the cabin. He walked with long, determined strides to the main gate at the edge of his property. The rifle held loosely in one hand. He was drawing the line, both literally and figuratively. Sheriff Miller reined in, his horse skittish. He was a man out of his depth, his face a mixture of official duty and personal unease. "Caleb," he began, tipping his hat. "I'm not here for trouble, but, well, there are concerns. Rumors coming out of town about the woman you're keeping here." "Mister, Vance has lodged a formal complaint. Says she might be a fugitive, involved in that business with her husband's death." The words were coated in a thin veneer of legality. But the intent was clear. It was harassment, an invasion sanctioned by a badge. Caleb stood motionless, his feet planted firmly on his side of the property line. "There's no woman I'm keeping here. Miller, her name is Leah." The sheriff shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable under Caleb's cold, unwavering gaze. "Be that as it may, I have a duty to investigate. I just need to ask her a few questions. That's all, for the record." Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle. The moment had come. All the years of silent grief, of suppressed rage, of lonely survival, culminated in this single, quiet act of defiance. He looked past the sheriff, towards the cabin where Leah stood watching, a solitary figure of resilience against the vast, empty landscape. He was not just defending his land anymore, he was defending his home. "No," Caleb said, his voice low and resonant, carrying a weight that made the sheriff flinch. "Her past is not your concern, and her future is not Vance's to control." He took a half step forward, the rifle now held at his side, its barrel pointing towards the earth but its presence undeniable. "She is under my protection. Any man, lawman or not, who crosses this gate without invitation will be seen as a threat to this home. This investigation of yours is over." He raised his eyes to meet the sheriff's. "You ride back to Redstone Gulch. You tell Corbin Vance he has his answer." Sheriff Miller stared, his mouth slightly agape. He saw not an angry rancher, but a man who had drawn a line down to the very bedrock of his soul. A line he was willing to die on. There was no room for negotiation in Caleb's eyes, no hint of compromise. Defeated. The sheriff tugged on his reins, turned his horse around, and retreated without another word. Caleb stood at the gate long after the rider had disappeared, the rifle still in his hand, a lone sentinel guarding the fragile world he had finally, irrevocably, claimed as his own. The storm from the town had arrived, and he had just dared it to break upon him. The aftermath of Sheriff Miller's retreat left a silence more profound and menacing than any that had come before. It was the unnatural calm at the heart of a gathering storm. For 3 days, a heavy, expectant quiet pressed down on the valley. The sky, once a brilliant, endless blue, turned to a bruised, sullen gray, and the air grew thin and sharp, carrying a biting cold that had no place in early autumn. The horses grew restless in the corral, their breath pluming in the frigid air, and the wind, which had been a constant, sighing companion, died completely. It was a silence that held its breath, and Caleb Thorne knew in his bones that it was a prelude to violence. He and Leah worked without speaking, their movements efficient and synchronized. A silent team preparing for a war on two fronts, one against man, and one against nature. The snow began without warning. It did not drift down in gentle flakes, but attacked from the sky in hard, sharp pellets, driven by a wind that rose from a whisper to a feral howl in a matter of minutes. The world beyond the cabin windows dissolved into a churning vortex of white, a blizzard that clawed at the log walls and screamed down the stone chimney. This was the cover Corbin Vance had been waiting for. This was the perfect storm, a force of nature that would erase his actions, burying all evidence of his crimes under a pristine blanket of white. Caleb stood by the window, his rifle in his hand, his eyes straining to pierce the maelstrom. The world had been reduced to this small, fragile fortress, a tiny island of warmth and light in a sea of blinding, roaring chaos. The first shot was almost lost in the howl of the wind, but Caleb heard it, a sharp, splintering crack that was not the sound of nature. A hole, dark and ugly, appeared in the thick wooden shutter of the far window. The siege had begun. As the sound of the gunshot echoed in the small cabin, A different kind of sound was torn from Leah's throat, a sharp, involuntary cry of pain. She doubled over, her hands clutching her belly as a vice-like contraction seized her body, stealing her breath, her eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Met Caleb's across the room. The dual battle had commenced. The storm without and the storm within had converged in this one. Desperate moment. There was no time for words. Caleb's mind, honed by years of survival, worked with cold, swift clarity. "Stay down," he commanded. His voice a low growl. "Keep away from the windows. Barricade the door after me." He moved to the back of the cabin, to a smaller, less used exit that led towards the barn. He knew he could not win a direct firefight. He was outnumbered and outgunned. His only allies were the blizzard and his intimate knowledge of every rock and ravine on this land. He slipped out into the raging storm, a ghost in the blinding snow, the world instantly swallowing him whole. The cold was a physical blow and the wind tore at him, but he embraced it, letting the chaos become his camouflage. Inside the cabin, Leah dragged a heavy wooden chest in front of the door, her body trembling with a fresh wave of pain. She was alone. The howling of the wind was a symphony of her deepest fears. Each gust a mocking laugh, each rattle of the shutters a threat. Outside, she could hear the sporadic crack of rifles, muted by the snow, phantom sounds in a world gone mad. Another contraction ripped through her, harder this time, forcing her to her knees on the cold, earthen floor. She gritted her teeth, her entire being focused on the singular, agonizing task her body demanded of her. Her fight was not with guns and bullets, but with the primal, relentless forces of life and death. She would not let her child be born into a world of violence, only to be extinguished by it. Caleb moved through the whiteout like an apparition. He could barely see 10 feet in front of him, but he didn't need to. He could feel the land beneath his boots. He circled wide, coming up behind the corral where 2 of Vance's men were taking cover, their forms blurry shapes in the blizzard. He fired not to kill, but to disable, to disorient. A shot aimed at the rock just above one man's head sent a shower of stone chips into his face, making him scream and fall back. The other man spun around, firing blindly into the snow, giving Caleb the opening he needed to melt back into the storm. He was a phantom, striking and vanishing, turning their numbers against them, using their inability to see as his greatest weapon. Another wave of pain crashed over Leah, so powerful it blotted out the sounds from outside. She was losing track of time, her reality reduced to the agonizing rhythm of her own body. Breathe, push, survive. She crawled to the cot, clinging to its rough-hewn frame as her muscles screamed in protest. Her fear was a cold, metallic taste in her mouth, but beneath it, a deeper, fiercer instinct burned. She was a mother protecting her young, a force as untamable as the blizzard that raged outside. She would not fail. Caleb felt a searing heat tear across his arm, a lucky shot from one of Vance's men. The pain was a sharp, clarifying shock. He pressed himself into the lee of a rocky outcrop, the snow stinging his wound. He knew he couldn't keep this up. They were closing in, their movements more coordinated as they adapted to the storm. He could see them now. 3 figures, including Vance, using the line of trees by the ravine as a pincer. They were driving him towards the narrow canyon at the base of Black Ridge, a natural dead end. And in their fatal certainty, an idea, desperate and wildly dangerous, took root in his mind. The wind roaring through the ravine was already a low, guttural rumble. The slopes above were heavy with new, unstable snow. He let them chase him. He stumbled, feigning exhaustion, drawing them deeper into the mouth of the ravine. The wind howled, the air thick with snow, a world of sound and fury. They followed, their rifles raised, confident that their prey was trapped. At the narrowest point of the canyon, with the snow-laden cliff face looming directly above them. Caleb spun around, he raised his rifle, and instead of firing at the men, he fired his last 3 shots upwards, aiming at a massive overhang of rock just below the cornice of snow. The impact of the bullets against the rock, magnified by the acoustics of the canyon, was like a crack of thunder. for a heartbeat. There was silence, and then a deep, terrifying groan echoed from the heart of the mountain. A fracture line appeared in the snowpack above. It widened, and then with a deafening roar, the world came crashing down. A tidal wave of snow, rock, and ice poured into the ravine, a force of nature unleashed. It wasn't a burial, it was a purgation. The avalanche swept past Caleb's position, engulfing Vance and his men, swallowing their horses, their guns, and their greed in a torrent of white oblivion. Exhausted, wounded, and running on pure adrenaline. Caleb fought his way back to the cabin. The blizzard was at its absolute peak, a physical wall of wind and ice. He burst through the rear door, a specter of snow and frozen blood, to find Leah on the cot, her face pale as the snow outside, her body arched in the final, desperate throes of labor. All the violence, all the strategy of the fight outside, dissolved into a primal, urgent need. He fell to his knees beside her, his skills as a marksman useless. He was just a man, terrified and helpless, faced with a power far greater than any storm. "Caleb!" she gasped, her hand finding his, her grip surprisingly strong. He held on, grounding her, lending her the last of his strength. He followed her lead, his rough voice a low murmur of encouragement, a steady presence in the sacred, terrifying chaos of birth. As the storm outside shrieked with a final, climactic fury, Leah gave one last powerful cry. And then, cutting through the howl of the wind, came a new sound, the thin, defiant wail of a newborn child. The battle was over. The storm, both outside and in, had broken. In the sudden, profound quiet of the aftermath, Caleb looked down at the tiny, perfect infant in Leah's arms, and then at the woman who had fought a war of her own and won. They were alive. A new life, born of the longest night, had just begun. The dawn that followed the longest night broke over a world transformed. The blizzard had exhausted its fury, leaving behind a profound and unnerving silence. A thick, immaculate blanket of snow covered the valley, burying the scars of the battle and muffling all sound, creating a world that felt both pure and isolated. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth and the gentle, rhythmic breathing of a newborn child. The violence of the previous night seemed a distant, nightmarish memory, vanquished by the quiet, undeniable miracle of a new life. Leah lay on the cot, her body a landscape of aches and exhaustion, but her heart was filled with a fierce, protective warmth that defied all pain. In her arms, wrapped in a piece of an old wool blanket, slept her son. Caleb sat in the chair by the fire, a silent, unmoving sentinel. His wounded arm had been crudely bandaged, a dark stain of blood seeping through the linen, but he seemed oblivious to the pain. He had not slept. His gaze shifted from the sleeping infant to the woman who had fought a battle as fierce as his own, and a feeling, foreign and overwhelming, settled deep in his chest. For years, this cabin had been a shell, a place to exist, haunted by the ghosts of what he had lost. Now, in the space of a single, violent night, it had become something else entirely. It had become a sanctuary. And he, its sworn protector. The anger and grief that had been his constant companions had not vanished, but they had receded, making way for a fragile, terrifying sense of purpose. The days that followed were a slow, quiet dance of healing. The world outside remained a pristine wilderness of snow, cutting them off from Redstone Gulch and the lingering threat of Corbin Vance. This forced isolation became a blessing, a cocoon in which they could learn the rhythms of their new reality. Caleb, a man accustomed to the brutal, straightforward logic of ranch work, was utterly lost in the delicate world of a newborn. He was clumsy, his large, calloused hands seeming gigantic and ill-suited for the simple task of holding the small. Sleeping bundle. He would bring Leah bowls of thin broth, his movements stiff and awkward, his face a mask of concentration as he tried not to spill a drop. Leah, in turn, found a quiet strength in teaching him. Her voice, though weak, was steady as she showed him how to support the baby's head, how to swaddle him tightly against the cold. These were their first true conversations, spoken in hushed tones in the warm, firelit cabin, a language of necessity that slowly blossomed into a language of trust. She watched him one afternoon as he held the infant. his weathered face etched with a look of profound wonder and terror. He was a man who had faced down storms and gunmen without flinching, yet he was completely humbled by the weight of this tiny, perfect life, in his vulnerability. She saw not weakness, but a goodness he had long kept buried beneath layers of grief and solitude. As the snow began to melt under the strengthening sun, the true extent of the storm's damage was revealed. A wide section of the barn roof had been torn away, fence lines were flattened in 3 different pastures, and Leah's small, hopeful garden was buried under a deep drift of packed snow. The work of rebuilding was daunting, a physical manifestation of the internal healing they both had to undertake. They began without discussion, falling into a natural partnership. He tackled the heavy, structural repairs, his powerful muscles straining as he hoisted new timbers into place on the barn roof. She, in her growing strength, handled the smaller, more meticulous tasks, sorting through salvaged materials, mending harnesses, and patiently untangling wire for the fences. Every nail he hammered into place felt like an act of defiance. Every fence post he set back into the earth was a reclamation of his land, his life. They were not just repairing a ranch, they were consciously, physically, rebuilding a home. The work was slow and arduous, but in their shared labor, the last of the walls between them crumbled. They began to talk more. Their conversations no longer confined to the immediate needs of the baby, but drifting towards shared memories and quiet hopes for the future. He spoke more of Samuel, not of his death, but of his life, of his laughter, of his unwavering belief that this land could be a paradise. She spoke more of Arthur, of his kindness, of his dreams of discovery, finding solace in sharing the weight of her loss. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, a new routine formed, while Leah nursed the baby by the fire. Caleb would retreat to the barn. She could hear the soft, rhythmic sounds of his work, the scrape of a handplane, the gentle tap of a mallet. He never spoke of what he was doing, and she never asked, respecting the quiet space he needed. The secret of his nightly labor was revealed one evening a few weeks after the storm. The ranch was mostly repaired, and a sense of permanence had begun to settle over them. He came into the cabin carrying his creation, his movements almost shy. It was a cradle, carved from the golden, fragrant wood of a pine tree that had fallen in the storm. It was a thing of simple, profound beauty. The wood was sanded to a silken smoothness, the rockers perfectly balanced to move with the slightest touch. On the headboard, he had carved a single soaring hawk, its wings outstretched. He placed it on the floor by the hearth, the firelight dancing on its warm surface. The silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken emotion. Leah looked from the cradle to Caleb's face, seeing the hope and the fear in his eyes. He had poured all of his unvoiced feelings, all of his longing for a future, into this one, perfect object. He cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on the floor. "The nights are still cold," he said, his voice rough. "He should have a proper place to sleep." He paused, struggling with the words that had been locked away for so long. He finally looked at her, his slate-gray eyes stripped of all their defenses. "This place, it's been quiet for too long. It needs a child's laughter to fill it up again." He took a deep, unsteady breath. "And I need you both to stay." It was not a proposal of marriage, not a declaration of love in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, more honest. It was a confession of his own profound loneliness and an admission that his life, once a barren fortress, now had a new, vital center. Tears welled in Leah's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude, of release. She looked down at the sleeping child in her arms, then back at the man who had saved them in more ways than one. She stood up and gently placed her son into the cradle. The baby stirred for a moment, then settled, cocooned in the warmth of the wood and the love that had built it. She placed her hand on the cradle's edge, her fingers tracing the outline of the carved hawk. "He has a name," she said softly, her voice clear and strong. "His name is Cole." She looked at Caleb, a small, radiant smile touching her lips for the first time. "It means strength, something born of the earth, that endures." In naming her son, she was giving her answer. She was planting a flag, putting down roots in this soil that had been consecrated by their shared struggle. This was no longer a temporary shelter. This was home. Caleb's shoulders, which had been tense with a lifetime of burdens, finally seemed to relax. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, transforming his weathered features. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently rock the cradle. As they stood together watching the boy sleep, a new silence settled over the cabin, not the silence of loneliness or of watchfulness, but the deep, peaceful, and contented silence of a family. The dawn, at long last, had truly come. Leah felt the changing of the season not in a calendar, but in the quality of the light, the winter, which had entombed the valley in a world of white silence, finally loosened its grip. The sun, once a distant, pale coin in a gray sky, now poured a liquid gold over the landscape, coaxing the frozen earth back to life. The snow receded from the high ridges first, then the valley floor, revealing the rich, red soil, dark and damp with promise. The sound of the creek, which had been a muffled whisper under the ice, returned as a cheerful, burbling song. Life was returning, and with it, a deep, bone-deep sense of peace that Leah had never known. The world was no longer a thing to be survived, but a home to be cherished. The rhythm of their lives, once dictated by the frantic needs of survival, now settled into the gentle, steady cadence of a family. The cabin was filled not with watchful silence, but with the small, contented sounds of baby Cole, his soft coos, his occasional cries, the whisper of his breath as he slept in the pine cradle by the fire. Caleb was transformed. The hard, solitary shell of the man he had once been had been irrevocably cracked, and the man emerging was one she was slowly coming to know. She would watch him as he held his son, his large, rough hands cradling the infant with an almost reverent tenderness, his weathered face softening as he looked into the boy's trusting eyes. He was a man rediscovering a language he thought he had forgotten, the language of gentle, protective love. One morning in late spring, Caleb announced he was riding into Redstone Gulch. It was the first time he had gone since the town had turned its back on him, and a flicker of old fear sparked in Leah's chest. But he met her worried gaze with a calm reassurance she had never seen in him before. This was not a journey of desperation, but one of simple necessity, a quiet re-entry into a world that no longer held any power over them. He returned that evening as the sun was setting, his saddlebags full of supplies, and a new, settled quietness about him. He told her the news as they sat on the porch, watching Cole sleep in a basket at their feet. The avalanche in the ravine, officially deemed a freak act of nature, had financially and spiritually broken Corbin Vance. His equipment was lost, his men had deserted him, and his reputation was in tatters. He had sold the Ophir mine for a fraction of its worth and had left the territory, a defeated man chasing ghosts in a new frontier. Henderson, the store owner, had been almost apologetic, pressing a bag of sweets for the baby into Caleb's hand. The town's fear, and therefore its hostility, had vanished with Vance. The threat was gone. A final, lingering shadow had been lifted from their lives, and the relief was so profound it was almost a physical presence, a warm weight settling over them. Caleb reached out and placed his hand over hers, a simple, solid gesture of shared victory and peace. The days that followed were the most beautiful Leah had ever known. They worked together, rebuilding the last of the fences, their hands often brushing, their movements a comfortable, familiar dance. Leah's garden, reborn from the melted snow, flourished under her care, its vibrant green a stark and beautiful contrast to the red earth. The ranch was no longer a place of sorrow or a fortress against the world. It was a place of life, a testament to their shared resilience, its roots now deeply intertwined with their own. They were a family, forged not by blood or by law, but by the shared crucible of a storm, a siege, and the sacred, terrifying miracle of a birth. One perfect, clear morning, after the chores were done, Caleb led her to the small, open space in front of the cabin. In his hands, he held a young cottonwood sapling, its leaves a tender, hopeful green. "My father planted one the day my brother was born," he said, his voice quiet with memory. He said a man needs to plant something he'll never see the end of. A little bit of faith in the seasons to come. Together. They dug a hole in the rich earth. Caleb worked the spade, his movements strong and sure, while Leah held Cole, the baby's sleepy warmth a comforting weight against her shoulder. They planted the sapling, packing the soil firmly around its delicate roots. A silent promise to the future, a new anchor for their lives in this place. When they were finished, Caleb looked at her, his eyes full of an emotion that needed no words. He went into the cabin and returned a moment later holding a small, leather-bound document, its edges worn with age. It was the deed to the ranch, the paper that held the history of his family, of his brother's life and death, of his own solitary existence. He held it out to her, his hand steady. "When I was alone," he began, his voice rough with feeling. "This was just a piece of land, a place to keep a memory. But a place isn't a home. You and Cole, you made it a home." He unfolded the document on the flat top of a fence post, smoothing it out with his hand. "It's not right that it only has my name on it," he continued, his voice low and certain. "A home belongs to everyone who builds it. It belongs to you as much as it does to me." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "Your name should be here. Leah, right beside mine." Tears streamed silently down Leah's cheeks as she looked from his earnest face to the document that represented so much more than land. It was his past, his future, his trust, his heart all offered to her freely and completely. Shifting Cole gently in her arms, she reached out and placed her free hand over Caleb's, where it rested on the deed. The paper was warm from his touch. "Our home," she whispered, her voice thick with all the love and gratitude she felt. It was a vow, an acceptance, a declaration. Caleb's hand turned under hers, his fingers lacing with her own. They did not look down at the paper again. Instead, together. They looked out across the valley. The sun was rising higher, climbing over the dark silhouette of the black ridge, spilling golden light over the creek, the pastures, and the small, hopeful sapling they had just planted. In the quiet of the morning, with their son sleeping peacefully between them, they watched the dawn of their new life, a life they had chosen, fought for, and built together, a place where their roots, at long last, could hold fast.